Welcome to today's session on hypothesis testing. So in hypothesis testing we have two types of errors, type 1 error and type 2 error. Type 1 error is falsely rejecting a null hypothesis when the null hypothesis is true. Okay. So a hypothesis is the one which is nothing but the assumption. Okay. So a null hypothesis is the one which we are making as a positive assumption. Okay. So we are falsely rejecting a null hypothesis when the null hypothesis is true. Okay. So that is called as type 1 error. So next is type 2 error. We are not rejecting an invalid null hypothesis. That is, the null hypothesis is actually false, but we are not rejecting it. Okay. So that is type 2 error. Okay. So these two errors are captured by two types of tests, one-tailed test and two-tailed test. Okay. So first we are going to see about one-tailed test in this session. So one-tailed test is a test of a hypothesis which is used to measure the relationship of variable in one direction which allows the hypothesis to be rejected. Okay. So that is, we have to reject the hypothesis by testing the hypothesis which is used to measure the relationship of a variable in one direction, and the hypothesis will be rejected. This is called as one-tailed test. Okay. So this one-tailed test is also called as lower tail test. Okay. So one-tailed test is also called as lower tail test. So we have seen what is hypothesis testing. That is testing whether the assumption made is correct or wrong. There are two types of errors possible in hypothesis testing. The first one is type 1 error and the second one is type 2 error. Type 1 error is nothing but falsely rejecting a null hypothesis when the null hypothesis is true. That is, we are rejecting the null hypothesis when it is true, which is wrong. And the next error is type 2 error, that is, we don't reject the null hypothesis which is false. Okay. So here we have one tail test and two tail test to capture these errors. Okay. So one tail test is a test of a hypothesis which is used to measure the relationship of a variable in one direction which allows the hypothesis to be rejected. Okay. So the lower tail test is similar to the one tail test. Okay. So we will have an example. Suppose we have an assumption. The null hypothesis here is, the assumption here is, suppose 60% of the citizens voted in the last election. Okay. So we are assuming that 60% of the citizens voted in the last election. Okay. And we have the data, current data, that 85 out of 148 people in the telephone survey said that they voted in the current election. Okay. So in the last election 60% of the citizens voted. That is the assumption. Okay. So but what is the statement? 85 out of 148 people said in the telephonic survey that they voted in the current election. Okay. So at 5% level of significance, is it possible to reject the null hypothesis? So as I told you, one-tailed test is to reject the null hypothesis. So we are going to see whether we can reject the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis is 60% of the citizens voted in the last election. That is, we have to prove more than 60% of the citizens voted in the last election. Okay. So that is the proportion of the voters in the population is above 60% this year. That is what we have to prove. So for that we are going to apply lower tail test or one tail test. Okay. So this is done using prop dot test function in R. Okay. So this prop dot test function will give you a p-value. Based on the p-value we will be deciding whether to accept or to reject the null hypothesis. Okay. So this is the function prop dot test, which is taking the values 85, 148. That is, 85 people out of 148 people voted this for this election, in this election. And what is the probability? The probability we are fixing to be 60%. So that is why I am giving p equal to 0.6. And alt is equal to less means it is lower tail test, okay, and correct is equal to false is the default parameter we are giving for this prop dot test function. So now let me execute this prop dot test function. So it gives us a p-value. So what is the p-value? The p-value is 0.5743243. So that is, it is greater than 0.05. That is, it is greater than 5% level of significance. So at 5% level of significance, we cannot reject the null hypothesis because the p-value is greater than 0.05. So we cannot reject the null hypothesis. That is, the proportion of the voters in the population is not above 60% this year. So what they said over the telephone is wrong. Okay, that is what we can conclude here. So it is not more than 60%. That is what the p-value is telling us. Okay, so this is how we can do the hypothesis testing for one-tailed test or lower-tailed test using R programming. Okay, so hope it is clear and useful. Thank you for your patience listening.